Last year, the global footwear industry, just in 1 year, during the pandemic, made 23 billion pairs of shoes. That's 3 pairs of shoes per person on the planet. And yet 1 billion people have no shoes.
Hello, I'm Marc Botenga. I'm a member of the European Parliament for the Workers' Party of Belgium, and I've got the big pleasure and honor this morning to talk to Vijay Prashad, who's a writer, a journalist, an intellectual from India, famous as well for the Tricontinental Institute you're directing right now. And we're going to have a chat about, let's say, the world, what it looks like, what we're going to. So maybe the first thing, amongst the many things you've done, you've written a number of books about international affairs. One of them has just been published in Dutch as well. Washington Bullets in English, but now in Dutch it's Imperialism for Beginners. But recently you've taken an initiative with about, I think, 400 organizations on no Cold War. No Cold War in China. Why? What's that about?
So, Mark, it's a pleasure to be here. This is the first time in Belgium for me to leave a hotel in Brussels. I'd come here years ago for a UN meeting, and you know how these things work. You land in the airport, you go to a hotel, you discuss about the world, but you don't get to see the world. You go back into a taxi, back to the hotel, and then to the next thing. That actually defines a lot of the problems in our world, is that the people who seem to have permission from the masses of us to make decisions about how the world should be organized don't seem to have a good connect with the actual suffering and condition of people on the planet. There has been, for the last 20, maybe 25 years, a narrowing of the concept of security. More and more people have begun to be told by those who, seem to be our betters, that security is understood as a kind of defense against military threats. Not the basic security of having a full belly, to have a secure home, to have a secure education, for your children to imagine a secure future. Those securities are gone. Now security is, do we have a large enough military? Is our military capable of staving off an imagined or real threat? This is how we are being told to understand security. Increasingly, in the last decade or so, from the administration of President Barack Obama, the United States government has become, on behalf of corporations, I should say, United States government has become extremely concerned about developments in China. Now, you would think, well, what are they saying they're concerned about? They say they're concerned about, human rights, freedom, Hong Kong, Taiwan, democracy, and so on. But in fact, they're not really concerned about that. And we know they're not concerned about that because, after all, the British government ruled Hong Kong authoritarianly without any elections for over 100 years and didn't seem concerned about that. United States not concerned about democracy in Saudi Arabia. It's not really democracy. What's bothering them is the Chinese technical scientific establishment has, in a sense, in many key sectors, green technology, high tech, telecommunications, they've gone beyond Western companies and therefore threaten existentially the dominance of Western manufacturing companies, industrial companies, high-tech companies, and so on, to have control over the sale of these goods in the planet. And so they've ramped up this warfare language, the security language. But really, is this what an ordinary person in Belgium should be worried about? This fantasy of China taking away your privacy, when your real problems are you don't know how you're going to pay your rent. You don't understand whether your pension is going to be yours or somebody else's. Those securities are no more on the agenda. That's the reason I'm very concerned, not just with the rhetoric about China, but what has happened to the idea of security.
But you're talking about a Cold War. Now, when I'm thinking Cold War, what I remember is United States, Soviet Union, which ended 89, 91. So do you think we will go in that direction again, to have a similar situation between, the United States and China? Perhaps, could it turn into something more? Are you afraid of military confrontation? How do you see that?
So the issue with the USSR, the Soviet Union, was also in the early period, in the 1940s, after 1945, there was a sense that there might be a military confrontation. And after the development of, serious nuclear arsenals, it became less and less certain that there would be a direct clash. And you saw proxy wars take place in different parts of the world and so on. In this case, both Russia and China have developed the capacity to defend their borders. Mm-hmm. See, Russia and China don't actually have the capacity to inflict harm militarily on the United States. Well, yes, if Russia launches a suicidal missile attack, perhaps, but they understand that they can't confront the overwhelming power of the United States and its allies, but they can defend their borders. I mean, China is clear, it can defend its borders. That's true. So I don't think there's going to be aggression from the Russians or the Chinese to directly militarily confront the United States. But what we do see, and this is what's really troubling, is the United States has since 2013 quite concertedly attempted to poke the bear and poke the dragon. This is their own language. Poke the Russians, poke the Chinese. What do I mean? In 2013, the United States worked with the government in Ukraine, for instance, to try to take Ukraine out of any relationship with Russia. This had a serious issue I'll come to in a second. And then secondly, there was an attempt to break Syria away from its relationship to Russia. Russia has two principal warm water ports, the port in Sevastopol in the Crimea and the port at Tartus in the coast of Syria. These are the only two warm water ports, substantial warm water ports that Russia has access to. The US was trying to take it away. That's the reason the Russians sent military aid to the Syrian government. That's the reason you saw the seizure of parts of the Donbass and Crimea and so on. These are serious attempts at undermining Russian power, military power. With China, every day, US and US-related British and some other NATO country warships go close to the Chinese waters. They call these freedom of navigation missions, provoking the Chinese military. I find these very dangerous developments. Why can't the United States sit down with the Russians or sit down with the Chinese and have a serious conversation about a range of issues rather than try to provoke them militarily in the Arctic as well? The serious provocation in the Arctic by the United States and its allies against Russian interests. We can discuss whether Russia is behaving appropriately or not behaving appropriately, China's behaving appropriately. This conversation can happen in a rational fashion. But why does the United States have to bring out the sword at the first instance and shake it around in the UN Security Council chamber, and rather than try to sit down and just talk?
No, it's what is remarkable, by the way, is looking at EU foreign policy or the foreign policy of European member states. How strongly they align with that policy, be it by sending fighter jets to the Arctic, be it to the Baltic Sea, or indeed supporting the United States missions close to the Chinese waters. However, what you mentioned was that this all started, or at least started to gain some traction under Obama. Now, we've seen that Trump has had a very aggressive stance towards China, but it's not changing with Biden. There seems to be this continuity. How do you explain that?
It's very interesting because in the United States foreign policy establishment, there's been a long debate about how to use Russia or China against each other. This goes back to the 1940s. When you read the US State Department policy documents, you see they are thinking about let's favor China against the Soviet Union. And this leads then to Kissinger's mission to Pakistan, Nixon going to Beijing, exacerbating the Sino-Soviet dispute.
Kissinger, who's a very famous, let's say, Minister of Foreign Affairs, as we would call him here of the United States, for many times.
Kissinger was the Metternich of American power. He's more than just the Minister of Foreign Affairs. No disrespect to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but he was the Metternich. I mean, he was
we
the
tend to forget how important he's been. At the time, but today many people here would have forgotten about him. But obviously
he's still alive,
and he's still alive, and he's still writing stuff. So,
but in fact, when Obama was the president, Henry Kissinger came back with an enormous book called China. where he tried to make the argument the United States needs to go back and make a very close relationship to China in order to isolate Russia. Because there's this US vision that if China and Russia get together in Eurasia, it will undermine American power. And that for the United States to have dominance over the world, the gap between Russia and China must be maintained. This is Kissinger writing in just in the Obama years.
But what you're saying is that basically this line, so Biden's not going to break with the policy of his predecessors.
I think it's more difficult now because the Obama administration miscalculated. In a sense, Obama, rather than trying to split Russia from China, went after both at the same time with pivot to Asia and then with this aggressive policy of moving NATO closer and closer to the Russian border. You know, there was an agreement made between Shevardnadze and Baker.
So that is a famous agreement you speak about. What was in it?
Well, those were two ministers of foreign affairs, Edward Shevardnadze and James Baker. And they said that, okay, the Soviets said, we will allow Germany to reunite. But NATO's border on the east will end at German border. It will not go into Poland. It will not, certainly not into Ukraine and so on. That at that point, the Soviet Union was still there. But it will end in Germany. This was a gentleman's agreement.
The agreement not to extend NATO or the influence of NATO up to the Russian or the Soviet border then?
Yeah, let alone to bring NATO to the South China Sea and to bring NATO into Africa, which is now on the table. That was the general orientation of the agreement. But Obama aggressively moved towards, the Russian border, at the same time pivot to Asia. What that had the impact of what that did was brought the Russians and Chinese together. So in the Obama period, the Russians and Chinese settled their decades-long border agreement and they signed a Russian-Chinese security agreement. They don't say it's a security agreement, but it's a military agreement. They do exercises together, military exercises. There are military sales of arms and weapons on either side, and the militaries are getting closer and closer together. So the very thing that Kissinger said, or earlier than that, the foreign policy said, break them apart, is actually gone the other way. So during Trump's period, Trump came in saying he's going to favor the Russians against the Chinese, which is the reverse Kissinger. But that blew up in his face because the American foreign policy establishment would not allow Trump to reset the clock with the Russians. And so the Russians and Chinese now have a very close bond. At the meeting in St. Petersburg held every year, Putin and Xi Jinping have been greeting each other as old friends and so on. So Biden has no choice now, because now Biden cannot go to the Russians and say, look, let's reset the relationship. And he's certainly in no position to reset with Xi Jinping. So this has trapped the United States. And part of the so-called declining influence of US power has to do with not the rise of China, but the new relationship between the Russians and the Chinese. And the Europeans have simply not come to terms with this reality.
Now, there is one thing, though. We started off with the new Cold War, which is, I believe, a real risk. How do we prevent it?
I think that part of it is a direct work, very difficult work by political, social, civic organizations pushing back against this yellow peril, Sinophobia, hatred of China, which is developing. It's a very dangerous mechanism. Chinese people outside China getting threatened, beaten, and so on. We see evidence of that in the United States. I find that very disturbing. We've got to push back against the demonization of China. I think that's one thing that we really need to do. We need to make sure that we think about what our militaries are doing. The Belgian government sent 600 troops to Afghanistan. Why? What did they do there? For what reason? Belgium is the home to NATO. NATO is now going to be imagining itself as a global power. After having been bitten in the 20-year engagement in Afghanistan, it will learn no lessons. After having destroyed Libya and not allowed any discussion afterwards about what was the point of the bombing of Libya, no discussion, They're now imagining NATO Asia, NATO Africa. Come on, guys. Let's have some, seriousness of purpose here. Do we really want this NATO to expand beyond its initial mandate? Do you want all of your social treasure in your country to be used to build up your militaries? Why not, the decencies of people be taken care of before that? all of that is going to help us have a conversation about this Cold War. It has a lot to do with the new militarism. Let's have the new generation of weapons. Why?
But this is, the new reality and this continuity. U.S., let's call it intervention, or at least pushing, the boundaries towards the Chinese border, the Russian border. This interventionism, this is what we generally call, or very often call, imperialism, U.S. imperialism. Now, you have made the point that you're actually one of those people living on the other side of imperialism. How would you explain imperialism? What is imperialism really? The way you live it as well. I mean, the face of imperialism seen from India or from other countries in the South.
Well, imperialism is experienced even in the North. So, but let's just talk about it in a very simple way. You have a government in Venezuela which has oil that it wants to trade. It wants to trade it in a normal commercial way, but they are being prevented to conduct normal trade. Now, why? Who gives whom the right to prevent you from conducting normal trade? You and I want to trade something. I'm going to give you a book. You're going to give me a handkerchief. It's between the two of us. It's an agreement we make. Somebody comes in between and says, no, we forbid you from taking anything from Marc. Now, what gives you the right? We call those extra economic power. Mm-hmm. You're coming in and interfering with our normal relations.
It's a way of sanctioning and destroying the economy of another country, basically.
Exactly. Sanctions are in a very narrow way permitted by the United Nations Charter. What the United States is doing to 30 countries around the world, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, Lebanon, Syria, you name it, 30 countries, those are illegal sanctions because they don't have the kind of narrow authority of the United Nations Charter. That's a form of imperialism. Here's another form of imperialism. If you don't accept what we're saying, if you don't accept our deal, a mining company, US mining company shows up, says, here's the deal on the table. If you don't accept the deal, the ambassador is going to come in, the IMF regional chief is going to come in and they're going to say, well, we're going to make it difficult for you to get an IMF loan. You better take the American deal. That's imperialism. Imperialism is very prosaic. You don't have to have B-52s flying above you, dropping bombs. Yanis Varoufakis, who was the finance minister of Greece, put it very, very well. He said, today, coups don't happen necessarily by tanks. They often happen by banks. And that's a reality. We have to understand the nature of power, which is why I said imperialism is not something that is experienced only in India or in Venezuela.
But it is true, though, that the violent side, and you describe it as well in your books, your articles, you see it, the oppression, the exploitation, which is the basis of imperialism, because in the end it is about very often resources. I mean, you quote a petrol not for no reason. So very often, I mean, you live this and you see it in different ways. You've also at some point made a point, if I would have to choose between living in or growing up in a country, being poor in a country like India, which is, very much oppressed and exploited by imperialism, or countries trying to develop themselves, getting out of it, you would definitely choose the second one. Why? How?
Look, let's just be very frank. If I was to choose the last few years to be born in India in a poor family or to be born in China in a poor family, I would pick China any day. Okay. Why? Because in the last 60 years, the Chinese people have lifted 800 million people out of poverty. There are about 700 million Indians who are stuck in poverty today. No plan to remove them from poverty. Poverty is a very stubborn condition. It's not easy to eject somebody or yourself from poverty. It's very stubborn. I try to explain to people, as a journalist, I've done lots of stories on hunger. People don't understand what hunger is. Hunger is not that I feel something in my stomach. Hunger is a noise in your head. When a young person goes to school, if they haven't eaten in the morning, they can't listen to the teacher. They can't concentrate, Marc. They can't focus because there's this noise like a loud jet engine in your head. If you don't have a process, a set of policies, a dynamic in your society, a commitment to eradicating this very stubborn issue of poverty, it's just not going to happen. I see poor people in Europe, I see poor people in the United States, all over the world. But one of the interesting features of this Chinese experiment is that they have gone after poverty. In Brazil, the government of Lula, in the 2000s, they put as a priority Fome zero hunger. They were applauded by the United Nations. As soon as the process of Lula and Dilma Rousseff was ejected through an illegal method in the parliament, and the right-wing government of Temer and then Bolsonaro came in, hunger levels have gone up in Brazil. So frankly, I'm going to speak a little politically. As a socialist, frankly, if a socialist process doesn't put eradicating hunger, eradicating poverty at the center, we are not socialists. We just have a set of ideas. 1 billion people in the planet don't have shoes. Last year, the global footwear industry, just in 1 year, during the pandemic, made 23 billion pairs of shoes. That's 3 pairs of shoes per person on the planet. And yet 1 billion people have no shoes. In many schools, children cannot go to school if they don't wear shoes. So this eradication of poverty business is huge. And here in a place like India, half the population is poor. In Afghanistan, United States spent $2.26 trillion in 20 years in this war in Afghanistan. Today, half the Afghan people live in poverty. 3/4 of the Afghan people don't have electricity. Mark, how are you going to have education if you don't have electricity? When is a child going to do homework, or how will you read? How can you do online education, my friend? We talk about digital divide, say electricity divide. Now, why is this so? You've spent 2.26 trillion on Afghanistan. Where are you spending the money? This is imperialism. They are not interested in putting people, eradication of poverty, eradication of hunger at the core. They call it, sustainable development goals. They laugh at that. It's a joke for them.
It's two different things. I mean, Afghanistan's very clear. It's been in occupied basically for 20 years, and then you had this entire thing of we're going to build the state, we're going to build democracy, we're going to do and all of this clearly now collapsed. But if you look at India is not militarily occupied. Other poor countries are free countries, democratic countries. Now in your books you describe how there's a number of coups and so on that basically keep these countries under control. How would you link the struggle against poverty with the struggle against imperialism? How does that work?
Well, you see, this is when we have to come to a much more simple category of capitalism. Yes, the Indian government has a subordinate relationship to the United States. I mean, what would be sensible for a country like India was to create regional amity, cut a deal with the Pakistani government, stop the animosity, cut a deal with the Nepali government. India routinely closes the border on Nepal, a landlocked country. It's a very cruel thing to do. Make a new arrangement with the Chinese. Get involved in Asian development and regional development. That kind of thing. No. India has allowed itself to be used by the United States in alliance with Japan and Australia and something called the Quad, where they are basically putting the livelihood of the people on the table to put China back in 20 years. They're involved in this process. So yes, all of that is happening. At the same time, Indian government is committed to the well-being of the very, very rich. The Adanis, the Ambanis, people who are on the international list.
What are the Adanis?
Right. So that's interesting. Isn't it interesting that every country has the Adanis and the Ambanis? These are families who are close to political parties, and they seem somehow, generation after generation, to keep doing great. One reads in the newspapers about one of their children crashing a Maserati and, being drunk and falling into a pool. But that child now suddenly is the next great entrepreneur. How did they become entrepreneurs?
The big wealthy families with hereditary wealth as well.
Generation after generation. What happened to the classic social democratic principle of wealth taxes? The basic, shall I say it, the Calvinist ethic of everybody should make their own wealth by themselves. No, we don't live in that world anymore. I bet in Belgium you have Adanis and Ambanis and Tatas and Birlas and
We definitely do.
That's right. And so they are fine. They are doing great. Meanwhile, from their houses, they look out of the window and there are seas of slums, oceans of slums, when the UN reports that 1 billion people in the planet live in slums, it's an underestimate. But half of them, I feel, live in India. I just feel like, 85% of the extreme poor live in South Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. 85% of the world's extreme poor live in just these two parts of the world. There are more extreme poor people in India than in all of sub-Saharan Africa. But because of a racist mindset, people think, the poorest people are in Africa. This is a racist understanding of Africa. But more poor people in absolute numbers live in India. And why? Because capitalism suggests that the well-being of profit, the well-being of the rich is more important than lifting up the least of them. In other words, poverty, hunger, and so on. Which is why I say, for a socialist, our politics don't begin in the macro arena. Our politics begin with each person in our country. Each individual has to be lifted up, understand that they are dignified people.
Now, let me ask you a question. I mean, we've talked about the United States, the imperialist nature of the United States, sanctioning, aggressing, and so on. Now, many people would ask, we also see Chinese companies, taking over Western companies, investing heavily in Africa, albeit less obviously than Western or European powers. But still, is there not a point to be made, as some would say, that China can be considered an imperialist power? Now, you argue very forcefully that it's not, but I'd be very grateful if you could explain to us why exactly.
So there are many different aspects of this that should be seen. Firstly, all Chinese investment is not government investment. There's a lot of private investment. I mean, like any socialist establishment, there are things in the public sector and then there are things that are private. So a lot of the investment is private also. People like to confuse that and talk about Chinese investment. Okay. Now, what are the investments and what are they like? I'll take an example. Let's say here is Zambia and here is a copper mine. The Chinese will come on and put on the table an agreement and they'll say, we would like to have a 20-year agreement to mine the copper and we will pay X amount of money and we'll amortize it and we'll have a deal over the years, we'll increase the rates and so on. We can renegotiate after 5 years and that normal commercial thing. Then they'll say, to sweeten the deal, we'll build a road from here to the town, we'll build a hospital, we'll build 3 schools and so on. And because we're doing all this, Chinese central financial institutions will provide certain loans to the government. Right. That's a commercial deal. The Americans show up or the Canadians will show up and they'll say, we'll give you so much for the mine. And the Canadian ambassador will come along, the IMF chief will come along, and if it were not a landlocked country, there would be a US warship off the coast and so on. These are 2 deals at the table for the government of Zambia. Now, it's up to governments of Zambia, governments of India and so on to have our own national project and to be able to look at 2 deals and make an arrangement. Who do we want to choose? The thing is, the Chinese don't say we are forcing you to do this. They're putting a deal on the table. You want to leave the deal, you can leave the deal. I'll take now a concrete example. El Salvador wanted to build a port on the Pacific coast, a massive port. Would have been one of the biggest ports in the Pacific, rivaling Los Angeles. Very large port project.
So Central America.
Central America, yeah. And the government of China and private Chinese money made a consortium. They bid for building the port. The government of El Salvador agreed. President came to Beijing. They had a big public discussion and so on. On the way back to El Salvador, he stopped in Japan. At the time, Shinzo Abe was the premier in Japan. Abe met him privately and told the president, you have to break the deal with the Chinese. The Americans are not happy with you. When you get to San Salvador, they will be waiting to discuss this. So that he would think about this on the flight. He gets back to San Salvador. There is a delegation from American Creche, which is the American State Department project called Growth in the Americas. It's their facility. At the time, it was the administration of Donald Trump. His son-in-law's best friend or college roommate was the head of American Creche. So he was there in San Salvador. They met and the government of El Salvador broke the deal with the Chinese to make the deal with the Americans a worse deal commercially. So now people say, well, the Chinese are doing this, Chinese are doing that. Very interesting. At around this same time, The Atlantic magazine, a US liberal magazine, did a story written by US academics based at a US institution, which assessed whether China is conducting debt trap diplomacy. That's DEBT, the diplomacy where you get trapped by loans. They looked at the evidence carefully, particularly the Sri Lankan port of Hambantota, but others. And in this article, in the Atlantic magazine, they said there is no debt trap diplomacy. The Chinese come...
Diplomacy, just to make sure, is that I'm offering you a deal, but basically by cutting that deal, I'll be strangled in debt or whatsoever, and I'll be, bound to you forever. That's what they call debt trap diplomacy. I get in because I want the cheese, but in the end, I get cut up and locked up, whatever that.
Perfect. And in fact, the mouse is in the trap forever. The mouse will be in the trap forever. That's the general orientation.
And so you get an American magazine saying China is not actually doing that.
They assess the evidence, and based on the evidence, because you see, will they say commercial deals are bad? Like, should the Chinese not come to the table and say, look, we want to mine the copper and this is the deal we'll give you? There's no illegality in doing that. It really depends on why a government like El Salvador or Zambia would take a deal. So that's why I say part of the issue is there's no debt trap diplomacy. I don't believe it's happening. But the real issue is what's happening to our governments. The government in Pakistan, the government in Bangladesh, the government in... Do we have a project? Do we have something on the table? What's our dignity? Or are we just taking the first deal that comes to us?
But this is interesting because one of the points, obviously, and I'm going back, let's say, to the start of our talk, is that the rise of China also comes with a decline, a relative decline of the power of the United States and of imperialism, and imperialism in crisis as such. Now, is that a reason, for hope? Or first of all, how do you see the crisis? Are there elements that you can see? Okay, imperialism clearly is in crisis, and then secondly, this must give us some hope. But we'll get to the hope part later. But
well, firstly, I'm not sure imperialism is in crisis as such. Nobody should doubt that the United States has the world's most powerful military. It can literally destroy any country on the planet. It may not win battles, but it can destroy countries. You can ask the Libyans that, or ask the Iraqis, or ask the Afghans. It didn't win any of these battles. In fact, lost all of them. But they destroyed 3 countries. And we can ask the Saudis how they're doing in Yemen. They're obliterating the country. They can't win the battle, however. So the United States has a very powerful military. It still has a lock on the world financial system because, US Treasury Department still dominates the IMF, still dominates the World Bank. The SWIFT system is still taking orders from Washington.
The SWIFT, just to make clear, is an international system of payments. So if you get cut off from SWIFT, your banks can no longer, trade or make payments to other countries. Iran had this at some point, they cut it off. And so the country is completely isolated financially and economically. And this is controlled by, you're saying, the West.
Well, it's not technically in the United States, it's in Europe, technically. But they do take their orders from the US Treasury Department, and we've seen this in light of what happened to Iran. It wasn't the Europeans who initiated the cutting off of Iran from SWIFT. It was the US Treasury Department rules that really made the SWIFT managers terrified. And so this is a form of financial warfare. We've got the bombing warfare, we've got financial warfare, we have diplomatic warfare. I mean, how easily it is to sanction countries, diplomatically. But we have information warfare, Mark, and that's the most significant in a way. Because imperialism would be in crisis if the narrative of these countries was being checked or in doubt. How quickly they were able to ramp up anti-China rhetoric and say that us exploiting Africa? Not us, the Chinese. Take the case of telecommunications. Huawei, we are told by the information...
Huawei, the Chinese mobile company, let's say we all know, and that got sanctioned at some point, right?
Sanctioned. I mean, they wanted to provide 5G technology at half the price to Europe as well. And the US said to the Europeans, nothing doing, cannot touch this Chinese company because they will damage your privacy. Meanwhile, in Russia, Edward Snowden had released slides, or he was in Hong Kong then, he released slides to American media companies published all over the world, which showed that US telecommunication private companies were routinely giving information to the intelligence services of the United States. We already know it's happening, but we don't believe that. We somehow believe, oh my God, the Chinese will spy on us. This is information warfare. This is a direct indication of how silly the public debate is. So imperialism is not in crisis. It's able to manipulate information so cannily, so quickly. It's able to say to me, oh, you are a Chinese agent. See, why can't I go on a news program somewhere and say, but listen, you're asking me these offensive questions. I say to the broadcaster, you are an embassy of the United States. But he will say to me, no, you are from the Chinese embassy. You see, information war is an asymmetrical thing.
Clear.
They can easily color you and pillory you and say you're wrong. But in fact, the evidence suggests, like this Huawei evidence suggests, Mike Pompeo said Huawei might do this. US Secretary of State.
And previously at the CIA.
He was the head of the CIA and will likely be the next president of the United States. Mike Pompeo, it's a likelihood.
It's all on record, so we'll come back to you afterwards.
It's a likelihood. Mike Pompeo said that China might deliver information. Huawei might deliver information to the Chinese government. He didn't say it will. He said might. That was a public statement. But at the same time as he said that, we already knew what Snowden had revealed. And yet the US media, CNN and so on, didn't pick that up. They just said, oh my God, the fear of the Chinese stealing our information. I was very interested in how limited the context setting is. And that's how information war takes place.
That is a powerful technique. You're pointing someone else rather than looking at what your own government or whatsoever is doing. However, if you're saying that it's not really that much of a crisis, or at least their power to destroy or to convince is very strong, we need hope. We need struggle, we need hope, and there is hope, because there is a lot, and you write about that in different of your books and your articles, about the resistance to the system, which is, I believe, increasing, and many of the organizations you daily work with are active in this resistance. Now, how do you see that develop? How is this resistance going? Is it growing?
Well, we are at the Manifiesta, which is an incredibly hopeful event. I mean, at every tent, there are people bringing on the table interesting new ideas to change the world. Last night, Peter Merton's speech was very powerful, and it offered a way forward, talking about climate, talking about real democracy, about decency and how people should behave. I mean, we are surrounded by hopefulness in that sense. Tens of thousands of Indian farmers have been sitting on strike, essentially, against the Indian government for the last 8 months. They've been sitting around Delhi. We call it the Delhi Commune. It's the new commune, 150 years after the Paris Commune. 150 years tribute is being given by the Indian farmers. In many different ways, people are fed up with the present. We want to generate a future. We are fed up. We are part of a process called the International People's Assembly, large network of political, social movements joined together, trying to imagine what can the future look like. We are constituting something called Dilemmas of Humanity, which will be debates and discussions globally about new ways forward. On the 16th of October, 25 research institutes led by ALBA TCP, which is the Bolivarian area, and the 9 countries that are united in a treaty, a mutual treaty, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and so on. We will release a document called A Plan to Save the Planet, which is a detailed document about how to create decent policy in a world where policymakers seem to have lost their way. They seem to be so committed to protecting the value of money rather than protecting, the future of humanity. So there's a lot of hope in what we're doing, Look, Mark, frankly, the future isn't something that happens. You have to build the future today.
I'm absolutely hopeful. I mean, indeed, everything you see around here, but also throughout the world. I mean, the strikes in India, to be honest, our media and generally have very little attention for India. But these mass movements of farmers, they were terribly impressive. I mean, to all of us, really, it was a source of inspiration as well. So, Vijay, unfortunately, this is all we've got time for. But I really want to thank you. I mean, it's been inspiring as always. So I would, encourage everyone to read at least an article, but preferably one of your books. And I'm looking forward to seeing you very soon again.
It was great to be with you. And Belgium, 11 million people, whatever, it's the epicenter. It's the epicenter. All eyes are on you, Marc.
That's
you.
That's a lot
on
of
you,
pressure.
Marc.
That's a
on
lot of
you.
Thanks for the pressure and the support. See you later.
Thanks.